She did not ask to be beautiful. The empire decided that was her crime. Listen carefully. Because what happened inside those walls was buried for centuries. Hidden beneath gold and ceremony and the careful silence of men who had everything to lose if the truth was ever spoken aloud. Tonight, we speak it. Tonight, the silence ends. The Ottoman Empire. 1574. The most powerful civilization on earth. Stretching from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. From the mountains of Persia to the shores of North Africa. 40 million souls governed from a single palace perched above the cold blue waters of the Bosphorus. Topkapi. A name that meant the cannon gate. A name that promised both grandeur and violence in the same breath. And inside its walls, behind its iron gates and marble fountains and corridors that seemed to have no end, lived the women. Hundreds of them. Thousands across the years. Brought from every corner of the empire. Brought not by choice but by selection. Not by invitation but by force, dressed in ceremony. They were called the harem. And the harem was not what the stories told you. It was not silk and perfume and idle luxury. It was a machine. A political machine. Ancient and efficient and utterly without mercy. And in the year 1574, a girl arrived inside it who would set that machine against herself simply by existing the way God had made her. Her name in the palace records is Rayhan. It was not the name her mother gave her. That name was taken at the gate, stripped away along with everything else that connected her to the world outside the walls. She came from Circassia. From the mountain villages that the Ottomans raided for girls the way other empires mined for silver. She crossed the Black Sea in the hold of a merchant vessel, listed in the cargo manifest between bales of silk and sacks of pepper. She was perhaps 15 years old. Perhaps 16. The records do not agree because the records did not consider the precision worth keeping. She arrived in autumn. The city was burning gold and copper. The minarets rose into a sky the color of iron. And the chief eunuch who processed the arriving girls, a man who had seen 10,000 faces pass beneath his appraising gaze and felt nothing, stopped when he reached her. Looked again. Said nothing. In a man paid to be unmoved, that silence said everything. She was given new clothing. New instructions. New rules delivered in a language she barely understood. She was placed in the general quarters of the harem, a vast, echoing world of women learning the same grammar of survival she would spend the next months memorizing. How to walk. How to lower your eyes. How to be present without being seen. How to make yourself useful without making yourself dangerous. Every woman in that place had mastered this grammar. Every woman in that place knew that the line between favor and destruction was thin as a blade and twice as sharp. And every woman in that place, within days of Rayhan's arrival, understood that something new had entered their world. Something that changed the weight of the air when it moved through a room. Something that the grammar of survival had no rule for. Because you cannot teach a face to be ordinary when God has made it extraordinary. You cannot instruct beauty to stand down. The Valide Sultan heard about her within 3 days. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, the true power of the harem, a woman who had clawed from slave girl to queen mother across 40 years of blood and patience and ruthlessness so refined it had never once been called by its real name. She summoned Rayhan to her chambers without warning. No explanation. No preparation. Just 2 guards appearing at the door and a gesture that could not be refused. Rayhan was brought through corridors she had not yet learned, past fountains she had not yet seen, into a room heavy with incense and authority. The Valide Sultan sat and looked at her for a very long time. The kind of look that contains an entire calculation. That adds and subtracts and measures and concludes. And when she was done, she spoke 3 words. Only 3. And the old woman who translated them whispered them in Rayhan's ear with her eyes on the floor. 3 words. God help you. She knew. The Valide Sultan had spent for decades reading this palace the way a general reads a battlefield. She knew what that face meant. She knew what happened when something that beautiful arrived in a place built on the economics of beauty. She knew that the Sultan would see her. She knew that when the Sultan saw her, the careful arrangement of power that the Valide Sultan had spent years constructing alliance by alliance, concubine by concubine, son positioned against son would face a variable it had not accounted for. She knew that the only question was not whether to act. The only question was how. And how fast. The Sultan saw her on a Tuesday in October. It was not arranged. Or perhaps it was. In the politics of Topkapi, accidents were frequently constructed. Whatever the mechanism, Sultan Selim II, a man of vast appetite and dangerous sentiment, inheritor of the greatest empire in history, a man whose court had learned to manage him the way you manage a fire, useful, necessary, and always one wrong moment from consuming everything. He turned a corner in an inner corridor and she was there. Carrying a tray. Walking with the particular carriage of someone who has not yet learned to make herself smaller. Eyes forward. Spine straight. The tray held steady in her hands with a grace that had no instruction behind it, only the natural authority of a body moving the way it was made to move. He stopped. The corridor was empty except for them and two attendants who immediately found reasons to look elsewhere. He stood in the torchlight and he looked at her, and the 45 minutes that followed are a gap in the official palace schedule that the scribes recorded as the Sultan's time of private reflection. 45 minutes. Private reflection. The aftermath was immediate. Rayhan was elevated. Moved from the general quarters. Given rooms with a window in Topkapi was status made architectural. Given clothing that announced to every woman who saw it exactly what had occurred and exactly what it meant. The veterans of the harem, women who had survived this before, women who had watched this happen to others and understood its trajectory the way sailors understand whether they did not congratulate her. They watched her with the careful eyes of people calculating what her elevation changed about their own positions. Some retreated. Some recalculated. And one did neither. The most important one. The one who had already decided. The Valide Sultan's response was not rage. Rage was for women who had no other instrument. She had many instruments. She chose whispers. The harem ran on whispers the way the palace kitchens ran on fire. Whispers required no signature. Whispers left no evidence. Whispers moved through a closed world faster than any written order and with the particular power of things that cannot be directly denied because they were never directly stated. She seeded them precisely. That Rayhan had been seen speaking to a page from the outer court. That a letter written in a foreign hand had been discovered in her rooms. That she had been at a window at an hour when no woman should have been at a window. None of it needed to be true. It only needed to be repeated enough times in enough worried voices to become the texture of the air itself. To become the thing that everyone knew without knowing how they knew it. Rayhan had one friend. In the way that people in dangerous places make friends not through choice but through proximity and mutual recognition of danger. Her name was Delora. An older concubine. Perhaps 30. Never beautiful enough to threaten anyone, which had given her the freedom to develop something rarer than beauty, the ability to read a room precisely and say exactly what needed to be said. Delora came to Rayhan in the deep of night, when the corridors were watched but incompletely. She did not soften what she said. She said, "They are building a case around you. When it is finished, they will not put you in a cell. They will put you in the ground." Rayhan listened. She was 15 or 16 and she was impossibly far from home and she had been inside these walls for 2 months. She asked, "What do I do?" Delora said, "You go above. You go directly to the source. You tell the Sultan what is happening before they can finish telling him their version." She said, "The risk of speaking is enormous. The certainty of silence is fatal. That is not a difficult calculation." It took 3 weeks to get the message through. 3 weeks during which the whispers grew louder and her privileges began quietly eroding. The window room was needed for repairs. Her clothing allotment was delayed. Her attendants found other obligations. These were the preliminary moves. The ones designed to establish a narrative that the Sultan's attention had already moved on. That she was, essentially, already over. Already forgotten. 3 weeks of watching herself being erased in real time while she waited for a chain of borrowed favors and careful hands to carry a folded paper to the right place. The message reached him. The emperor cancelled his evening appointments. He walked alone in the inner garden for 2 hours. The scribes recorded this. They recorded nothing of what he was thinking. 2 days later, Rayhan was summoned. Not to the great reception chambers. Not to the formal spaces of ceremony and display. To a small room hung with green silk, lit with pierced brass lamps that threw light across the walls like water over stone. He was already there when she arrived. He did not look at her the way he had in the corridor. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has become complicated. Something that requires navigation rather than simply desire. He asked her, through his interpreter, one question. What do you want? She understood immediately that this was the question on which everything turned. That the wrong answer, an answer that pleaded, that wept, that asked for protection in the language of weakness, would hand her enemies exactly the portrait they were painting. She straightened. She said, in the words of Ottoman Turkish, she had spent 2 months absorbing with desperate concentration, looking directly at him in a way that no woman in this palace looked directly at anyone. I want only to serve this house faithfully. And I ask only that this house be honest about what it does to me. The interpreter hesitated before translating. The Sultan looked at her for a long time. Then he sent the interpreter out of the room. And he spoke in a low voice, alone, in Turkish she could only partially follow. Whether he knew she could not fully understand, or whether some words are meant to be spoken rather than received, that question belongs to God. What is recorded is only what happened after. He summoned the Valide Sultan the following morning. Private audience. No scribes. What was said is not recorded. When it ended, 3 women who had been spreading whispers were transferred to a subsidiary palace on the Asian shore, which in Ottoman court language meant roughly what exile means in any language. The administrator who had overseen the erosion of Rayhan's privileges was replaced. And Rayhan was returned to her window room. The repairs had been completed. It should have been an ending. It looked like an ending. Delora, when she heard, allowed something onto her face that it rarely performed. She said, "You are still here. For now, that is everything." But the Valide Sultan was not a woman who accepted defeat. She reclassified it. She withdrew the whisper campaign not because she had surrendered but because she had recognized it as the wrong tool. You do not bring down a wall by blowing on it. You find where it is already cracked. You position yourself at the crack. And you wait. She was very good at waiting. 18 months later, Rayhan carried the Sultan's child. In the harem, a child transformed everything. A son was permanence. A son was political architecture made flesh. A son meant that the mother moved from the category of favorite, temporary, replaceable, subject to the economics of attention, to the category of mother, which operated under entirely different laws. A mother of a prince had claim. Had stake. Had, in the event of the Sultan's death, the possibility of becoming what the Valide Sultan herself had become. The power behind the next throne. The woman who outlasted everyone. The Valide Sultan had 8 months. She understood this precisely. She did not waste a day of them. She found a physician. A man of Greek origin who served the harem's medical needs. A man who had his own obligations to his own survival and understood that the Valide Sultan's quiet requests were not requests at all. What she asked him to do is not stated in the documents that survived. But there is a phrase in Ottoman administrative correspondence of this period used to describe medical interventions concerning the health of expectant mothers that appears once, in connection with Rayhan's name, in a document dated for months before the expected birth. The phrase, the name, the date. Together they form a sentence that the official language was designed to prevent from being read directly. We are reading it directly. Delora found out. She always found out. She had spent 30 years learning to read the small changes in a closed world, physicians visiting too frequently, certain herbs disappearing from the medical stores, a new attendant assigned to Rayhan whose previous post had been in the Valide Sultan's own household. She came in the night again, the way she always came, through corridors watched but incompletely. She said, "Something is being given to you that you are told is medicine." It is not medicine. Rayhan dismissed the attendant the next morning. She found another physician through means that should not have been available to her, at a speed that suggests the existence of a network that the official harem records were never designed to acknowledge. The Valide Sultan received her report. The arrangement had been discovered. 48 hours later, Delora was gone. Her entry in the harem roster shows a transfer. No destination. No further record anywhere. The word is reassignment. There is no record of where she was reassigned to. There is no further record of her at all. Rayhan understood what it meant. She understood that she had won a battle and that the war was already decided. She understood that she was inside a machine whose fundamental purpose was to process women, to use them and discard them and erase them, and that her beauty had not elevated her out of the machine. It had only drawn the machine's full attention toward her. She understood that whatever life remained to her would be lived inside these walls, subject to these forces, for however long those forces decided she was useful. The child was born. A son. Registered. Named. Given his place in the hierarchy of princes. For 3 months after the birth, the palace rearranged itself around the new reality. Rayhan had achieved the rank of Harseki-favored concubine, mother of a prince. She had arrived, in the technical language of the system, at its highest reward. And then one morning in early spring, she was summoned to the Valide Sultan's chambers for the second time. She walked the same corridors. She was escorted by the same chief eunuch, whose face had learned across decades of service to reveal nothing and preserve everything. She was brought into the room heavy with incense and authority. She stood in the morning light. And the Valide Sultan looked at her for a very long time in silence. The silence of a woman who has already made her decision and is allowing the weight of it to settle before she speaks. Then she spoke. Quietly. In the formal Ottoman of the court, which Rayhan now understood with near-perfect fluency. She said, "You have a son. He will be raised as a prince of this house. He will want for nothing. He will be educated. He will be protected. He will be given every advantage this empire can offer." A pause. The kind of pause that contains everything not yet said. "And then, you will be transferred to the old palace. Today." The old palace. Eski Saray. Where women went when they were finished being useful. Where the discarded favorites aged behind walls that no one visited. Where beauty went to wait for death in rooms that smelled of old incense and older regret. Not a dungeon. Not an execution. Too visible, too crude, too much risk of a sultan's grief becoming a sultan's suspicion. Just a transfer. Just a document. Just the phrase in the interest of the mother's peace and health written in the same careful hand that had written the physician's instruction for months before. The same phrase. The same handwriting. A different kind of ending. Rayhan did not weep. The record that survived fragments, held in a Slovakian archive, recovered by a historian in the 19th century who was looking for something else entirely, describes her as standing very still for a long time. Looking at the Valide Sultan with an expression described only as knowing. And then she asked for one thing. One single thing. She asked to see her son before she left. The Valide Sultan was still for a moment. Then she nodded. What happened in the room where a mother held her child for the last time that silence cannot be filled? We can only stand at its edge. We can only acknowledge it existed. That it was real. That a young woman who had crossed the Black Sea as cargo, who had survived 2 years of the most dangerous political environment on earth through intelligence and courage and one devastating friendship that had just been taken from her, she held her son. In a palace that would give him everything. In a world that was taking her from him before he was old enough to remember her face. She was escorted out through a side gate used for deliveries and transfers. There is no record of whether she looked back at the walls. The Bosphorus was cold that morning. The cherry trees along the inner garden were in bloom. The empire continued exactly as it had always continued, enormous, meticulous, indifferent. She died in the old palace. The year is unclear. The records at Eskişehir were never kept with the precision of those at Topkapi. She was, by the available evidence, somewhere between 35 and 40 years old. Cause of death recorded as natural causes. Buried in a cemetery attached to the palace grounds. Her stone marker gives her palace name and nothing else. No origin. No age. No mention of a son. No record of the 2 years inside Topkapi. No record of what she survived and what she lost and what was taken from her in a room that smelled of incense on a spring morning when the cherry trees were in bloom. Rayhan. Basil. The fragrant herb. The name was never hers. The stone says nothing true about her. And yet the stone is there. In an overgrown cemetery that no one visits. In a city that has grown up around and over and through the ruins of the world that built it. The stone is there. Saying the wrong name over a woman who deserved to have her real name said. Her son grew to adulthood. He served the empire with documented competence. He signed documents. He attended councils. He is noted in the official record as reliable, moderate, loyal. He never visited Eskişehir. The records confirm this with the thoroughness they applied to everything. He never asked, in any document, about a woman named Rayhan. If he knew what had been done, he kept it in a room inside himself that he never opened. The Valide Sultan outlived everyone. She died at an age that surprised the scribes who recorded it. She is buried in a mausoleum of considerable grandeur. Tourists visit it. Her name is in the history books. Her political intelligence is praised. Her survival across 5 decades of imperial power is presented as remarkable, as evidence of an extraordinary mind operating within the constraints of an extraordinary world. Both of those things are true. The world is large enough to hold 2 things being true at the same time. That is, perhaps, the darkest lesson of all. The harem of Topkapi is a museum now. Tourists walk through it in summer, taking photographs, reading placards. The corridors are lit with electricity. The silence is the silence of a museum, not the silence of a sealed world. The cherry trees in the inner garden still bloom every spring. The Bosphorus is still cold in the mornings. And in an overgrown cemetery somewhere in this city, a stone stands in long grass with a single word on it. A word that was not her name. A name chosen from a list by a man who did not see her as a person. A name given at a gate to erase the name her mother whispered to her in a mountain village on the other side of the Black Sea. She was not just a name on a list. She was never just a name on a list. But the empire decided otherwise. And empires have walls thick enough to make their decisions permanent. This is what power does when it encounters something it cannot own. It does not destroy it openly. It transfers it. It reassigns it. It writes a phrase in careful language about health and peace and administrative necessity. It uses the machinery of order and protocol and official record to do what a blade would do too visibly. And then it buries the stone in grass and waits for the grass to grow high enough that no one asks whose name is underneath. Beauty did not curse her. Power did. Power looked at her face and saw the one thing it could not file and process and manage. Power saw something free. And freedom, inside walls 30 feet thick, is the only crime that cannot be forgiven. She is still there. In the grass. In the stone. In the cold morning air above the Bosphorus where the cherry trees still bloom for an audience that has long forgotten her. But the wind remembers. The wind was there. The wind has always been there. And the wind does not forget the names that the stones were never allowed to carry.